Hi, Suzy.
Hi, Kristen. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good.
So welcome to the Weekend Blog. This is my first go-round without Bill, but I'm excited for this week and to discuss the Weekend Blog with you.
Yeah, that's definitely enough going on, here in Washington as well as plenty of news overseas. So I think we have quite a full agenda of things to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Well, the first big one that I'm sure there's been quite a lot about on both sides of the blogosphere is about the sort of continuing resolution spending whirlwind and how that's sort of pitting, or at least in the blogosphere, how there are a lot of conservative bloggers who are very unhappy with Republican leadership and how they have how they are handling the march to cut spending. What have you read on the lefty side of the blogosphere?
So it's been interesting just over the last couple of days. I mean, it's funny that the Senate actually, I just read online just a few minutes ago, the Senate actually did officially pass this sixth temporary stopgap spending measure, to fund the government for the next 3 weeks. They just passed that this afternoon. So yeah, it's been interesting to notice on the left. A number of liberal bloggers are almost giddy about what's been happening on the right. Just a couple of days ago, you had Republican House Speaker John Boehner, basically have a revolt on his hands. I don't think anyone expected 54 House Republicans to vote against the CR because they didn't believe it went far enough, because they were unhappy, with concessions they believed the Republicans were making. And so Boehner was actually forced to effectively rely on a whole bunch of Democrats in order to get the CR passed, which he did want to do. So I think, I think this, on the left at least, there's been talk about whether the Tea Party right and the conservative base has gone too far, and now, Boehner kind of has his hands full. He's stuck between, wanting to please them, to appease them, to fulfill the mandate that the Republicans say that they have. And on the one hand, on the other hand, if the government shuts down, given these kinds of divisions on the right, there is definitely a chance that the public could be inclined to blame the Republicans and not the Democrats. So I think Boehner is stuck in this dilemma, and I think liberals are kind of just watching this unfold and sort of wondering where this might take him and take the GOP in the weeks ahead.
Well, there's definitely is a lot of sort of rancor among conservative bloggers about the direction that House leadership has taken. I guess the most prominent post would be one from Wednesday at Red State by Eric Erickson, where he posts basically about he got contacted by a reporter who had said that there are a lot of sort of hit jobs being put in place by congressional Republicans about the conservatives who won't go along with things like the CR. And at one point in the post, he has a quote where he says, "See, I'm on the side of smaller government and more freedom. These House Republicans seem to be in favor of smaller government in the abstract, just not in the real world." But, that's not the only opinion that's out there on the conservative side. You also have Keith Hennessy blogging at keithhennessy.com about the title of the post is "A Different Strategy for Impatient Fiscal Conservatives." And he starts off the post by sort of reaffirming his own fiscal conservative credentials. He says, quote, "I support cutting spending even more deeply than the original House-passed bill. I support and place a high priority on stopping implementation of Obamacare and the new EPA regulatory authorities. Yet I think this move being voting against the CR, is short-sighted and even a counterproductive tactical blunder. Legislating is a team sport. You win when you can build a coalition to achieve your goals." And basically then goes on to say that, if folks are voting against this, from a principled position, that they then ought to discuss a viable strategy for getting more cuts in place if it's a principled issue. And if it's a strategic issue where they believe that these CRs are reducing our ability to, get a good deal when we pass, a more permanent solution, Keith Hennessy's post says, quote, "Please explain how you expect to win in a public shutdown fight and how that public battle will increase your leader's hand in negotiations with Leader Reid and Team Obama. And that instead of threatening to oppose the next CR no matter what, impatient fiscal conservatives should demand that their party leaders ratchet up the spending cuts in the next CR, suggesting that if they took the next CR to $3 billion instead of $2 billion or something like that. If you incrementally make it tougher and tougher and less appealing each go round, that might be a way to sort of split the difference. But then back on Red State, there was a response to that exact post from Russ Vought, who says that the first viable alternative strategy is to force Senate Democrats to pass a bill. That currently the very willingness of Republicans to do these short terms absolves Senate Democrats and the president of any responsibility. And I think that's one of the places where Republicans potentially have some sort of political advantage here. There's a Washington Post poll that has a lot of bad news for Republicans, but also has some bad news for the Obama administration. The bad news for Republicans is things like when it comes to dealing with the economy, Obama has an advantage. 46% say they put more faith in the president. 34% say so about congressional Republicans. The congressional Republicans have not had much of a message out there, and certainly have not had much of a message regarding spending besides what I think is a good statement, which is we're broke. I think it's something that many voters would agree with. But they haven't yet gotten to the point where I think they see that that a government shutdown would be good for them, and aren't fully ready to go for the big battle over what we want in the budget, doing the things like defunding Planned Parenthood and NPR and all those things as part of a bigger package. And so that's the big controversy, I think, is, going back to that quote from the Eric Erickson post where he says, "I'm on the side of smaller government and more freedom. These House Republicans seem to be in favor of smaller government in the abstract, just not the real world." I think that the Keith Hennessy's of the world and the folks working on the Hill would actually say that their strategy is the one more focused on smaller government in the real world, not just the abstract, and that given the fact that we don't have the White House, given the fact that we don't have the ability in the Senate to do what we want, that by taking the position of going at this in sort of a piecemeal way until we feel confident that we can get the best deal possible, that sort of pragmatic way of looking at it is smaller government in the real world, and that the sort of wish list of things that folks wish we could do, that is just in the abstract, because if Obama doesn't sign the bill, Obama doesn't sign the bill. So that's sort of where the division is. And I think there's a lot of frustration on the part of many conservatives who feel, we worked really hard, the Tea Party got very ginned up, and we elected all of these new folks to Congress. And Hugh Hewitt at townhall.com sort of likens it to, handing a general, he uses a Civil War reference. He says, George McClellan was the dashing commander of the Army of the Potomac at the start of the Civil War, whom the troops loved, but whom Abraham Lincoln scorned as timid and quick to retreat. And that this is the equivalent of giving a general a bunch of troops, and then that general not wanting to go to war with them. And so what was the point of putting all of these conservatives in Congress if Boehner's not willing to really go to war? I think the fact that you've seen so many continuing resolutions is why this has built up. Because the very first few times, it seems like each progressive one, you hear a louder and louder chorus of voices saying, enough is enough, let's push for the hard fight. And so this sort of sentiment that, okay, Republicans, you have a majority, let's really take it out for a spin, is becoming more and more prevalent as this debate gets pushed off further and further.
Yes, I think one of the most interesting things is this distinction that you brought up between, principles and ideology and the real world, the folks who actually have to govern. And I think I was waiting to see when exactly this moment would end up coming after the election, that you can run on this message that sounds great, you can say no to every Democratic bill that you hate, and there have been vote after vote in the House to defund Obamacare, to repeal healthcare reform, on all these different measures. Actually, just another topic which we'll move on to a little bit later in terms of defunding NPR. These sound great, but ultimately, everyone I think knows in the end that they're not going to happen with the Democrat that said it. The difference is that Congress actually does need to pass a budget. This is one of the few things that actually does have to happen, and if it doesn't, there are real consequences. So I think this is one of the few instances. Everyone, I think there was a general consensus that after the Republicans took the House, very little would happen, but there were just a couple of, things that are just bare bones what the government does to keep itself going, and this is one of them. And I think this is when, those things, all these kind of high-flying principles and ideological concerns really do have to come back down to earth. And so it's been interesting to see, folks who might have been, that they agree sort of in principle in terms of actually accomplishing it. I mean, I'm sort of curious to see in terms of the Republicans who did vote against it, what their intentions were. I mean, were they, was this just sort of an ideological thing? They just thought that no money should continue for Planned Parenthood. Are there not these kind of riders that they were hoping to include, restricting funds for this or that? Or did they think that it would actually result strategically in a better move for them, that they would strengthen their hand and so forth? Because before, I think Keith Hennessy's post was very interesting in as much as he laid out the scenario in which Republicans would support the CR, but would also ratchet up the demands in the ways that you kind of described. And if it did come to a government shutdown, they could say, well, we supported these bills, these excessive bills, to continue to fund the government, and then they could just put it in the Democrats' court. They can make the Senate Democrats and Obama be the ones who turn against it, and instead they're stuck in this position. There was this post by Brian Bortler over at Talking Points memo in which he imagines, a scenario that either, Boehner is going to have to give in to his right flank and possibly force a government shutdown, as it would result in a bill that Senate Democrats won't likely be happy with, or he, if he chooses option B, in which he will need Democratic votes, and it would really, as he says, abruptly flip the dynamic on Capitol Hill, where Republicans have been riding high since they trounced the Democrats in the November elections. So, he raises this possibility, which even just a couple of weeks ago, not to say, immediately after the November election, that Boehner, is Boehner going to have to compromise with the Democrats? And I think the question, that I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on, Kristen, as well, is, how much the Republican, House Republican line is that, in terms of leadership, is that they don't want to shut down the government. This is not something that at least Boehner and, the other Republican leaders are saying, but, would, at this point, is he still willing to go for it? Is that something that, he could be convinced to see is a good thing politically for the Republicans, or is that something that Boehner will want to avoid? Maybe not at all costs, but at least at some costs.
I think Republicans really want to avoid a government shutdown. Even the Red State Post from Russ Vought that I mentioned, sort of at the end of it, he has a quote where he says, quote, "All of this requires Republicans to act and talk as if they understand the seriousness of our fiscal crisis. $2 billion here, $6 billion there does not accomplish that. They need to restore leverage to the negotiations with a willingness, but not a desire, to shut the government down." I don't think that Republicans, I think I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. They're very afraid, remembering what happened the last time the government shut down. It was not really a big political winner for Republicans. I think this time, I think they want to avoid it. And what I'd be most interested to see is, does Boehner try to stretch this out as long as he can as we get closer to something like the debt limit, where that's not just talking about shutting down government. That could have much, much, much more serious implications. And if somehow you begin to package these two things together, where Boehner is able to say to Obama, look, I'm not going to be able to get these folks to vote to move the debt limit if we've had to give them a raw deal on the budget. So you need to take these $61 billion in cuts. We'll, make little deals over the symbolic things, but, you need to by and large take the Republican budget plan and go with it, because if I don't put this out there, then there's no way I'm going to get these folks to vote with me on the debt limit, and we could have a real problem on our hands. I don't know if that's what's going on in their minds, but I think, knowing that that's still looming out there is a pretty big deal. And if conservatives in the House are profoundly unhappy and grow more and more unhappy with the continuing resolutions and things along those lines, I think when it comes down to that much bigger vote, I think it could be tough and problematic. But the spending that we've been talking about today is all sort of, it's talking about more of the short-term spending. And as Hugh Hewitt mentioned, that in his post, he said, quote, "The phony cuts assembled thus far, the GOP talking points say $8 billion have been sawed off from the federal budget, have not resulted in a single layoff or program closure. One could look for months to see no effect from these paper cuts." There's also a growing chorus of folks who are saying it's time for presidential leadership on entitlement reform, because that's, these little cuts here and there, defunding NPR is not going to save us from our fiscal crisis. That instead we have a big problem where, Social Security is not bringing in more than it's paying out, or isn't, that the negative projections about Social Security solvency are changing rapidly. And you had a quote today, or a quote on the 17th from Harry Reid, who says that, quote, 2 decades from now, I'm willing to look at it, being Social Security reform. And he said this in an interview to MSNBC, but I'm not willing to take a look at it right now. This was from a post by Jennifer Rubin at Right Turn at the Washington Post. What are you seeing in the blogs on the left about entitlement reform and potential cuts to Social Security versus Medicaid, et cetera?
Well, I think there are a couple of things there. I mean, one is that I think that despite what happened just a couple of months ago with the deficit commission that the President Obama himself had pulled together, despite recommendations that have come up in recent months to, go after Social Security, I think, unless you go sort of farther left to bloggers like Jane Hampshire and Fire Dog Lake and those kinds of folks, far more on the extremes of the ideological spectrum, I think that for the most part, liberals do feel confident in what Harry Reid has said, that the Democrats and Obama in the White House, for many reasons, political as well as principled, aren't going to touch Social Security. And in effect, despite what I know that a whole bunch of Senate Republicans have signed on to a letter recently saying that they won't vote to raise the debt limit unless that, cuts were made to Social Security. I'm not sure how much the Republicans will want to run that either. I mean, there are extreme political risks for both parties. I mean, this is why everyone keeps kicking the can down the road, because no one wants to touch Social Security, even though in terms of our long-term fiscal health, there do need to be fundamental reforms made. I mean, I think where this might be going ultimately might be more in terms of looking at Medicaid cuts versus Medicare cuts. And the way the Democrats could end up framing this, this would actually sort of play into whether or not they're going to be willing to defend healthcare reform, because Obama's Affordable Care Act actually does contain a number of cost-containing long-term reforms for Medicare itself. It goes after the Medicare Advantage program, which covers private plans that seniors can take even if they're offered Medicare benefits. They see these as actually subsidizing the private insurance industry, and that the government actually has been proven to spend money more effectively. They've launched also separately, efforts to combat fraud and recover money. I mean, those are some areas where I think there actually is some bipartisan support in terms of fraud and waste within the system. There's some reforms within that. There could be some there further. So that would sort of be a third way, I think, to go after this without sort of things politically imploding. I mean, one thing that I do think, you've seen this, I've written about this myself, and you're sort of seeing growing calls about this. I think there will be a temptation by the Republican Party, and all sort of signs point to this, to go after Medicaid itself. I mean, not only for political reasons. I mean, you'll have liberals arguing that liberal bloggers and other folks saying that, well, it's much easier for the Republican Party to go after Medicaid because it covers poor people, disadvantaged folks, who tend to vote Democratic, tend to be more minority, live in more urban districts, so on and so forth, versus going after Medicare or Social Security. It's older voters tend to vote more Republican, whiter population, so on and so forth. But Republicans, they do have a point that Medicaid is an issue that state governments themselves have been trying to bring to Washington's attention. States are partly responsible for paying for Medicaid, and they've been obviously crushed by their own budget problems, their own fiscal troubles. And so I think Republicans are going to try to, they've already started kind of riding that horse. They've called up a bunch of governors to Washington to testify on Medicaid reform, which could end up giving the states a lot more leeway to cut back on these programs. And I do see a political fight sort of around that, because I think that is an issue that is really at the heart of, in terms of democratic principles of the social safety net, and wanted to protect the most vulnerable, even at a cost to other programs and to some savings the government could accrue. I do see a political fight growing about sort of around that going down the road.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money when it comes to Medicaid sort of being a primary target for Republicans, because as we saw in the healthcare debate, I mean, Republicans were pretty big on, don't mess with Medicare. Look at what this program is doing. It's slashing Medicare to pay for all this other stuff, and so that was obviously a point of argument that was very that found a lot of support among seniors, and that certainly didn't hurt Republicans at the polls, which I think is why however, you've also got a lot of folks who, speaking of, things Republicans are afraid of, looking back in their past, are afraid of a government shutdown because that didn't turn out as very well last time, but also afraid of touching the Social Security issue, because when President Bush, sort of riding high off the 2004 election, put his privatization idea out there, it cratered. And it wasn't explained very well, and it instilled in a lot of folks a very obvious amount of fear and concern. And so, I can see why right now Democrats would not want to touch the Social Security issue, but I can't help but wonder if this sort of, I think everybody in Washington knows that the entitlement programs are really where the painful cuts are going to have to happen. And there's a quote from John Hendrick at Powerline, where he was talking about the letter that you mentioned, that was signed by Marco Rubio and 22 other Republican senators. And the letter's most interesting observation, he says, is the one where he says, quote, "Without action to begin addressing the deficit, it will be difficult, if not impossible, for us to support a further increase in the debt ceiling," which goes back to, what we're saying before. To what extent are folks, are Republicans going to say, we need to be confident that all X, Y, and Z are occurring before we're confident that raising the debt ceiling will not just continue to feed the beast and allow us to think that there's no problem. And the quote from the Post, he says, quote, "Obama, of course, has zero interest in showing leadership with respect to our fiscal crisis. His only interest lies in seeking political advantage. Once Republicans go on record as favoring tough choices to prevent the national canoe from going over the financial waterfall, still, it doesn't hurt to ask." And I think that Obama is smart in sort of not trying to take it. I think anybody heading into re-election does not want to be the guy saying, "I really think we ought to, raise the retirement age or cut back benefits." But it's one of those things where I think when Democrats like Harry Reid have these statements where they say, "Oh, look at Social Security reform 2 decades from now," I don't think that's going to win a lot of confidence with voters either. And I think that's just the sort of thing that is a way for Democrats to lose the Social Security debate, is by pretending that there isn't a problem. Because while Social Security itself may have been earning surpluses for years and years, those got raided. So I think that that's a political liability for Democrats, is if they don't take seriously the concerns around Social Security. Republicans will have a very nice talking point in saying, if we don't make minimal changes now, we're going to have to make enormous changes later. And you, Mr. Young Voter, are not going to see a dime of Social Security 30 years down the road. So enjoy it while you can. I think that each side has some really big political potential issues that they may run into that are going to be difficult for them to navigate, to say the least.
No, for sure. I think some of these issues are just going to become even more pressing, just given the demographic changes. Young voters can see that there are going to be more senior citizens. Their parents, their grandparents, this generation is going to make up the largest number of Social Security and, other kind of government entitlement benefits for seniors in history. And I think that's going to become apparent, kind of in all kinds of ways. And I think, I think the message that, look, hey, in the past, we had, the principle that the old would be, basically that young voters are going to end up having to pay even more so, and then they might not even accrue the benefits for themselves. And I agree that is an issue that will eventually need to be tackled, whether it's politically desirable or not. And I think I honestly don't think it's a bad thing. And I think you will have more kind of pragmatically minded progressives and liberal bloggers kind of concur with this, that yes, on the one hand, it's good that there are folks kind of holding down sort of the ideological line that we shouldn't touch Social Security, we can't really mess with those benefits, but to be pressed on that question and for, perhaps there might be a space for some more reasonable compromises to go ahead. And I mean, I think, again, sort of going back to healthcare reform and how that sort of plays into all of this, there's an opportunity there for Democrats and for progressives to step forward to say, hey, there actually are cost savings in this to Medicare. There is a new Medicare Payment Advisory Commission whose very job is to be able to sort of single out which treatments are the most effective and worth being reimbursed versus other stuff that we're just kind of wasting money on. Unfortunately, you also get the political divisiveness around something like that. I mean, this very panel has been called kind of the new death panel, that this is going to end up resulting in government rationing and so on and so forth. So, even at the opportunities when Democrats do come forward and offer solutions that will result in long-term cost savings, you have these kind of inflammatory attacks. So, hopefully within this discussion, there will be kind of serious-minded folks who are willing to talk about these kinds of compromises alternatives, but, it's just become increasingly difficult to do so, just given how partisan everything has become.
And I think both sides of a debate around something like this have potential liabilities that need to be weighed. So on the one hand, you would have conservatives who would, advocate for reforms to Social Security that may involve cutting benefits or may involve means testing benefits or, whatever the plans put forth. But generally, you're not going to see conservatives advocating for a tax increase as a way, an increase in the Social Security tax as a way to sort of paper over big differences down the road. On the other hand, I think I think Democrats would have a tough time agreeing to benefit cuts. And so what's less unpopular? Raising taxes or cutting benefits? I think both are highly unpopular, but I think Democrats may have an advantage in that, in order for benefit cuts to be helpful, you'd really need to start them sooner. And then tax increases, you could claim, we can get to those 20 years down the road, like Harry Reid said, we can figure that out when we need to. So I think that the immediacy of the problem is something that Republicans will have to really fully convince folks of, and I think that if they're able to do that, that will be a real liability for Democrats. And that the more quotes like that from Harry Reid, the more help sort of that Republicans will get in saying, this is critical and something that we need to take care of. But for the next topic that we were going to discuss is about something else that Republicans would like to see reduced spending on, and that's NPR. Just before we began filming this show, the House voted to defund NPR. Suzy, what are you seeing on the left about this?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think there's just the sentiment overall. I mean, House Republicans even held a hearing on this issue. There's, why now? Why in the midst of all of the, extremely serious and pressing fiscal issues that the nation is facing in terms of long-term entitlements, in terms of the short-term budget, in terms of the economy, in terms of jobs, in terms of an employment rate that, has made some improvements but has a good ways to go. In this entire environment in which members of Congress are already grappling with all of this, why go after this? I mean, obviously Republicans have, in terms of the culture wars and so forth, not been a fan of NPR, PBS, these kind of media outlets that receive government money that they perceive to have a liberal bias, so on and so forth. Why jump on this now and waste this time? I mean, I think that's sort of been the most convincing kind of argument. I mean, you can go back and forth as to whether the government should support this program or that program, whether this outlet or this other outlet has bias or not. And, obviously the answer, I think everyone can agree, goes back to this stunt pulled by James O'Keefe. The kind of hysteria and reactivity, not just on the right, but by NPR itself. I mean, the way that I think there was a lot of hand-wringing, and I think the blog post that I shared with you earlier from NYU professor and sort of media critic Jay Rosen brought this up, is that NPR was just as exhibited an extraordinary degree of reactivity, of kind of cowardly behavior, really. I mean, I think
the quote was the tote bag to the knife fight.
Brought a tote bag to the knife fight was his approach. And I think, the thing for me, I guess there are two things. One is, yes, you have this question coming from the left as to why House Republicans are wasting their time on, these kind of culture wars when there are so much more pressing issues at stake. And the fact that the criticism about NPR didn't even seem to focus. I mean, you barely heard cited a single story that NPR had produced. It was just in terms of, in terms of this video sting, it was, this NPR executive who isn't even in charge of editorial content, he's in charge of the fundraising element of it, making some, very unsavory comments about Tea Partiers being racist and so on and so forth. He, clearly should have, I think, there's various controversy about the way that tape was edited and presented and so forth. But anyway, he left, and then immediately, the executive director stepped down just days afterwards. It's this crazy environment in which I think you have seen this not just within media outlets, but even P.J. Crowley, a State Department spokesman who recently stepped down, is that based on a remark or two or a small number of remarks, people can be fired or pressured to leave or whatever have you within this kind of extremely reactive media sort of political environment. And I think that's the thing that, that's besides the House Republicans kind of jumping on this and politicizing it, that's the other thing. And I think for me, is the more interesting thing, this development that we've seen over the last year or so in which this continues to happen. I mean, this exchange itself happened on video, not on Twitter, but we've all seen examples of this in recent months. And I think that for me is a question that I think people are continuing to debate, I think, on both sides.
Yeah, I think that the conservatives have long not, disliked NPR, but I think that now with the fiscal conservatism sort of in the air and the need to cut spending, I think, with some of the more incremental cuts, like going back to the criticism from Hugh before, that, no full programs were closed. And so by taking things like Planned Parenthood or NPR, these are real tangible things that even though the financial cost may be minimal compared to other things, it's things that, they are saying, to what extent should taxpayer money be going to this? And if taxpayer money shouldn't be going to this, then here, there's a chunk that we can add to try to get to our $61 billion. And so I think that it's, I oddly enough don't think that this would have happened in a more hotly culture warrior type moment, because of the prominence of the economy, I actually don't think that social issues are really, really at the forefront of Republican politics right now. And that's a whole other source of debate between conservative bloggers and Republican leadership. And, that's why folks like Mitch Daniels are getting criticized when he called for a truce on social issues. But just right now, at least establishment Republicans are not terribly focused on social issues. And many voters are not. That's sort of just, even if you are a social conservative, the reality in the polls is that things like the economy and jobs are far more to the forefront, that deficits and spending are far more to the forefront. And that's just a reaction to where the American public is at, and that's how leaders and folks in D.C. have set their priorities. So I think, oddly enough, in a moment where culture wars were more prominent, I don't know that you would see this. I really think that this push to defund NPR is coming about not because folks want to make a culture warrior sort of argument. I mean, folks certainly are making the argument that it's liberal and all that, but by and large, why should the government be in charge of funding? There are media sources out there that don't require government funding. So why is it that NBC doesn't need government money in order to get news out to people? Why is it that ABC or Fox News or CNN, they don't need government money to get their information out to people? So to what extent is it really critical for us to spend money on, national public radio when we are broke? So I oddly enough think that it's more the fiscal conservatism of the moment that is having, mainstream Republican leadership push something like this, rather than a desire to crack open the culture wars. Because Republicans sometimes win when it comes to culture wars, but sometimes lose. Whereas I think that polls have shown Republicans tend to do a little bit better when things are on spending in a political environment like this.
I think it's interesting the way that I agree that definitely they used in terms of this issue gaining the kind of political traction that it has. I guess one, people understand what NPR is. I mean, a lot of these kind of government programs, and whether you're talking about entitlement reform or appropriations for this particular agency or that particular agency, I mean, people's eyes kind of glaze over. What is that? I'm not really sure. NPR, it's in their homes, it's in their cars. It's around. People understand what it is. Mm-hmm. I think it's. I think I do credit the Republican Party for being able to kind of latch on to those things that have that more immediate impact and the American, sort of the average American kind of grasp really quickly, rather than sort of throw a bunch of numbers in sort of abstract terms and that sort of thing. I mean, I think in terms of political messaging,
but it also presents a risk too.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course as well, because in terms of how the public might react to that, that's definitely true. But I do think, just not in terms of this sort of fiscal versus social issues thing. I agree that in terms of framing the question as, rather than, is NPR too liberal? Should the government just be funding this entity, whether or not it's liberal or whatever have you? I think, rather than, it's sort of an interesting fusion of the two. I mean, I think it's a moment in which you have folks, who maybe have long cared and wanted to push these kind of social issues to the forefront. They have an opening now to be able to do so. I think the Planned Parenthood fights, were clearly indicative of this. I mean, it wasn't, the wrangling wasn't so much over Roe versus Wade, so much as government money being put towards abortions and so forth. But but you do, at the same time that you don't have the leadership necessarily going after this in the Republican Party, you do have members of the Republican Party, like those who put together a bill that tried to redefine, what rape was, and that, government money shouldn't be used, to fund abortions except in cases of rape, and they tried to toy with exactly, what defines rape, and they tried to make that even more narrow than had been the law. So, I think you do have these openings in which, even though the dominant message is fiscal, you do have sort of social conservatives and other folks who've kind of long gone after these issues, sort of use that to their advantage. To try to move on, to sort of move in and revive these wars in a different kind of way.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been interesting, though may not be the best move for conservatives, is I would like to see more examples of slanted coverage, because I think folks, when people when people hear a story, they can parse out what, that there's a slant to it. But a lot of what I've seen in the conservative blogosphere thus far has been sort of around the ideology of the folks leading NPR, which really was set off by the Juan Williams firing. But you had a post by Doug Powers at michellemalkin.com. This was a couple days ago, where he said the headline was, "Shocker, 11% of NPR board member political donations didn't go to Democrats," and talks about, their political ideology as a product of their political giving, and how, 89% of it went to Democratic candidates. And so, obviously, that's something that's in play when it comes to defunding NPR. But I think, rather than focusing just on the ideology of the folks running it, because, I think, we've established that fact, I think that they could garner more support from the political middle by focusing on, if they want to make this a case that it's about bias and not just a case about this is something where we should cut because we don't have the money for it. I think that presenting more examples, presenting some really sort of stark examples of where the coverage itself has gone really awry, I think would be something that I would like to see in the future a little bit more.
No, and I think, NPR, in terms of, I agree that the fight has really, in terms of the way it's been discussed, has focused on, not what do they produce, although, the charge kind of extends to that. My perspective is, who's running this, does this fit into this sort of grand conspiracy to control the media. But George, the latest O'Keefe thing to come to light was his supposed revelation that George Soros gave money to NPR. This whole video behind this. In fact, this is not some kind of grand feat of muckraking expertise. The news that George Soros had given, $11 million to NPR to cover local state houses, to cover a cause that I believe, is in the public interest in a non-partisan, non-ideological way, was news. I mean, it was news all over the place. But it feeds into this narrative, and I think you've seen this both on the right and the left. It's been interesting in recent months. It's focused more on campaign finance, but it's sort of an extension of the same thing. On the left you have folks like George Soros and, the liberals running NPR, whatever other entity, and on the left, now you have, the Koch brothers and their money kind of sprawling out all over the place, and you almost see these things as parallel developments, just in terms of, I think it's just indicative of where the political culture is at right now, and just how polarized it is, and just in terms of maybe not where the American public is, but in terms of those who are sort of most engaged in talking about it. Each side kind of has this sort of grand theory that kind of ties everything together in terms of how the opposition works and what their ultimate devious plans are, which is, just been interesting to see these developments kind of arise in parallel.
Well, one issue on which there is a little bit more synergy between at least some Democrats and the right is on the issue of nuclear power, which I guess will be our sort of last topic for the day. Given the tragedy in Japan, there's obviously been a sort of higher tempo debate about the future of nuclear power in the U.S. and to what extent folks can believe what we're hearing about the risks coming out of the current situation in Japan, or the risks on this side of the Pacific, and to what extent should nuclear power continue to be viewed as something we ought to pursue in the U.S. And I know on the right there's a lot of belief that the media is really, and I don't think this is ideological, I think the media is just prone to overhyping dangerous situations. Maybe not necessarily always overhyping, but it's definitely more in a media source's interest to say, here's this really dangerous story, keep following us constantly for updates, instead of, here's something that's really terrible over there, but don't worry, it's probably not going to affect you. But please, we promise, tune back in and watch us again. Even though this probably won't affect you directly, watch us because, it's... And so I think you've had a lot of conservatives frustrated that they think the media is really taking nuclear power as a whole to task and sort of, trying to get rid of it as an option for power in the United States and sort of poison public opinion about it, when even President Obama, I believe today, came out and said, I still believe nuclear power is safe and something that our country needs to pursue. Are you seeing anything? Is there a divide on the left about what the role of nuclear power ought to be in the future?
Well, I think there's, honestly, I do think that there was immediately, and you kind of saw this on both the left and the right, in terms of what this means for us. Even before we had any idea of what was going on in Japan, what the risks really were, the risks were to the people there, this is something that, even more so than the actual debate. Just this kind of culture of reactivity in which immediately the question wasn't them, it was us. What does this mean for the future of policy? What are lobbyists doing on this? On the one hand, yes, I'd imagine, like in every scenario, lobbyists on both sides are going to be pushing this, using this to their opportunity. Obviously it's raised in the public consciousness and the public awareness. I think on the one hand, I appreciate, and I think that a lot of, sort of liberal bloggers and folks on the left feel like these questions are worth raising. Obviously, I think that the difference, though, and I think this is where you sort of see the divide, is, what questions does this raise about how safe nuclear power is, how we should be using it in the U.S., what kind of place it plays in our sort of energy portfolio, to what we should be doing about it. And the idea that, the answers to those questions are clear and obvious, and, obviously no nukes, no nuclear power, we should sort of shut down what we have immediately, that sort of thing. I think there is going to be more divide on that, and just in terms of pragmatically speaking, what are we going to do going forward? I think you are getting, though, I think there's more consensus, or at least there seems to be over the last couple of days, that that the left is going to be a lot more resistant to any kind of energy compromise, even if Obama ends up coming up behind this. That includes a significant expansion of nuclear power, as had been discussed when there had been talk about having any kind of energy bill. I mean, I guess the real issue is that hope had faded, hopes had been fading about any kind of sort of energy reform happening anytime soon. They kind of came back a little bit. Maybe we could do a smaller sort of energy package rather than a huge sort of cap and trade and energy and everything other. And I think the prospects of that, I think there is a lot of fear and a lot of concern, and folks are grateful that for the fact that in fact there had been sort of growing consensus from more sort of moderate progressive folks that yes, we can include nuclear energy in a kind of package. I think there's a lot more skepticism about that. But again, I think it's a bit early to say. Everyone, the situation continues to go on in Japan. When the crisis situation does die down, I think it could be a different political climate. I think things tend to move really, really quickly. And I think Obama making that statement, I'm perhaps surprised that he had waited so long to weigh in, but obviously the situation remains uncertain over there as it is in Libya. I don't think we'll have time to get to that topic this time around. But I think we're still kind of in the midst of the heat of all this, and I think there are a lot of people trotting out worst case scenarios of all kinds, reacting to concern that they feel for their own safety as well as what's happening halfway across the world.
Yeah, I think the quote from a blog post that I feel best sums up my sort of opinions on it at this point is from Ala Pundit at Hot Air, whose post from March 16th starts off with, "Now I'm really confused," in response to the sort of grand discrepancy between the statements from the U.S. nuclear chief and the statements that we're hearing out of Japanese authorities about the risks and such, in which you saw play out, there's a 50-mile radius that U.S. officials are advising American citizens to get out of the range of the plant, and that's much smaller for Japanese authorities and what they're recommending. And so Ala Pundit's post basically says that he's confused, but doesn't really know who to believe in this situation. And they list there's an article that he cites that mentions just how much radiation is being detected at things like the plant's main gate. And he goes on, the quote is, his quote, "Those levels aren't even considered dangerous. My ignorance of this subject is on full display here. But shouldn't that be impossible under JASCO's, the U.S. nuclear chief's scenario? Assuming Japanese officials are telling the truth, which is a big assumption, there's no way that spent fuel rods melting in open air should produce lower levels of radiation, right? Either he's wrong or they're lying," in response to the claims now that radiation is going down at the plant, but also that the situation is worsening. And I think there's just a lot of confusion about how bad this current situation is, and I think how it turns out will play a very significant role in what public opinion looks like about nuclear power in the future. But the other thing that conservatives are talking about a lot, this is especially prominent theme on National Review right now. There are a bunch of posts all on this topic. But the one that I had sort of referenced before, it's Lou Dolinar at The Corner he posts a story that ABC News posted a story all about this, about some some engineers who had quit a project because they felt that the design of the reactor was unsafe. But later on, buried down in the story is the gentleman that had quit GE. He said that a series of retrofits to the reactors around the globe, or he agreed to a series of retrofits and compared them to bolstering of highway bridges in California to better withstand earthquakes. Like with seismic refitting, they went back, reanalyzed the loads and structures, and beefed up the ability of the containment to handle greater loads. So basically, buried way down in the story was, and then we went back and we really did make them very, very safe. And we feel that they're much more safe, even though we feel that they're less safe than the contemporary designs in use. That there's a lot of information that gets kind of buried in these stories about the safety, the overall safety of nuclear power, and how in this one situation it's being really hyped as this incredibly dangerous thing that is going to destroy huge chunks of the environment. And while that may very well be true, we don't have enough information at this point to know that. And so stirring everybody into an anti-nuclear power frenzy may not be a very responsible way to go about it. Then again, I agree with all the pundit. I'm confused, and I am not a nuclear scientist, so I have no idea how this may turn out. I hope it does not turn out for the worst. I think we can all agree that we hope that there is not any significant or long-term damage as a result of this horrible situation in Japan.
Yeah, no, I think that in terms of just overall, and I would put myself in this category as well, the amount of confusion and conflicting information that's come out there from different officials, sometimes from the same officials who are saying different things, based on what they know, based on, you have accusations now that against the Japanese government for not being more forthcoming, for trying to downplay the threat rather than play it up. I mean, you have sort of pointed queries from that from both sort of liberal bloggers, folks concerned with energy issues, along with just the Japanese public as a whole. I mean, I think that the danger is just in terms of pointing fingers, saying that, well, you're playing this down because of X reason, Y political reason, and so on and so forth in order to forward your own agenda. And I think that's that doesn't necessarily have to happen. We can admit that things are confusing, that people are saying conflicting things, and we can, speculate as to why that may be the case. But to, accuse the media of having, on the one hand, I do agree that
I don't think it's
the
an
media is
ideological
prone.
bias in this case. I just think,
I agree that the media, especially with the 24/7 news cycle. Yes, this is. I just even saw today, and I was almost kind of shocked by the way that this was played. That the nuclear reactor workers, the group of 50 or so individuals, who are really bravely going down there, are on a suicide mission, and that this is the way that this is. When I walked in the office this morning, I was, I write about the situation, but just to label it just as that outright, really did agree, seem to be overhyping the situation. I think that it really, a lot of this is about, sort of tone, and there were a lot of discussions about the tone of our political rhetoric after the terrible shooting of Gabby Giffords and so forth, but that seems to have, kind of gone and been forgotten, just in terms of, raising questions and concerns versus, sort of leaping to turn this into, a kind of political bludgeon. And just looking right now, I think what you are seeing, definitely still on the left, are questions being raised about, whether we need nuclear power at all. I think Brad Plumer, has an article in the New Republic saying that, now everyone's asking this question, and the answer actually is more complicated than you might think. That there are ways in which we can rely on alternative energy sources to try to replace not only nuclear power but also coal, coal burning, which I think is what a lot of nuclear proponents say is, that's the next alternative, and that's even worse in terms of safety and so forth. There are these solutions out there that we can at least begin to talk about, but he's not jumping to any conclusions that, yes, the answer is yes, we absolutely have these ways. And I think you do have a range of opinions on the left as to, exactly how, what we can take away from this and what this does mean for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think I'm sort of, I don't know if you ever played SimCity back in the day, but I know SimCity 2000, at some point along the line, we're supposed to develop fusion power, and that's supposed to save us all. So I'm anxiously waiting for that day, for that sort of SimCity prophecy to play out. Well, hey, Suzy, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Tell the viewers where they can read your work.
Sure. Again, I'm a reporter for Mother Jones Magazine in our Washington, D.C. office. You can go to our website, motherjones.com. You can also go to SuzyKhimm.com, which actually redirects to my author page on Mother Jones, so you can see all my work there. But thanks so much, Kristen, for having a great conversation with me this afternoon.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. Take care.
All right. Thanks.